The Galactic Council chamber wasn't a room. It was a living, breathing monument to the sheer, stubborn fact of survival. A colossal bubble of crystallized space-time, it floated in the heart of the galactic core, a silent, shimmering pearl in a sea of chaotic energies that would vaporize a starship in a heartbeat. The walls weren't solid. They were a constantly shifting dance of captured nebulae, their iridescent pinks and greens swirling in patterns that were supposed to be calming, designed by a species of squid-like philosophers who had died out 1,000,000 years ago. All it did was make me feel like I was swimming in a giant's lava lamp. I was there as an observer, a junior attaché for the Sol Federation, fresh out of the Diplomatic Corps Academy. My job was to make sure the official recordings were running, that the translation matrices were synchronized, and that the refreshments for the human delegation didn't contain anything that would dissolve a liver. A glorified intern with a security clearance, really. My name is Elias Vance, and at that moment, I would have traded my entire career for a strong cup of coffee and a view that didn't make my inner ear scream. The air, or whatever passed for it in here, was thick with the scent of ozone and the faint, cloying perfume of a dozen different biospheres. It hummed with the low, bass thrum of the gravity stabilizers and the high-pitched whine of the quantum communicators. The council itself was a ring of 23 seats, each one a marvel of adaptive ergonomics, currently occupied by representatives from the major galactic powers. There were the reptilian Vorkesh, their scales gleaming like polished obsidian, their forked tongues tasting the political climate. The graceful, avian-like Ethel, their feathers a riot of color, their movements so precise they seemed choreographed. The stoic, silicon-based Grom, who looked like walking mountains and communicated in seismic vibrations that made my teeth ache. And of course, the humans. We were the newcomers, the Deathworlders as the galaxy had so affectionately dubbed us. We were the race that had evolved on a planet with crushing gravity, a volatile magnetosphere, and a biosphere that seemed to consider sentient life a nuisance. Our reputation preceded us, breathtakingly violent, stubbornly resilient, and prone to doing the most illogical things for emotional reasons. The other races found it fascinating, terrifying, and more than a little baffling. I personally was just trying to blend in with the decor. The official session was about a trade dispute between the Vorkesh and the Ethel over a mining colony on a moon that had recently become a breeding ground for a rare, psychotropic fungus. The arguments were, as usual, couched in flowery, diplomatic language that masked the threat of economic warfare. I was half listening, fiddling with the settings on my datapad, when the first, almost imperceptible ripple of unease passed through the room. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling. The Vorkesh representative flicked his tongue, a gesture of unease. The Grom hummed a low, discordant note. The elegant Ethel representative cocked her head, her crest feathers rising slightly. Something was wrong in the air. It felt like that moment of static before a thunderstorm, a sharp, metallic prickle on the skin that had nothing to do with the atmospheric regulators. My eyes, drawn by instinct, found the source. It was the entrance to the visitors' gallery, a high archway of woven light that shimmered at the back of the chamber. A small, nondescript figure was shuffling in, accompanied by a guide. It was a child, a human child. A little boy, no more than 7 years old, with a mop of sandy hair and the slightly dazed look of a tourist who was both amazed and bewildered. He was dressed in a new, crisp jumpsuit, the kind you buy for a special occasion, and his small hand was firmly held by his guide, a weary-looking Grom attendant. Children were rare on the council floor. The political tensions were considered far too volatile for their presence, but there were exceptions for high-level diplomatic families or special educational tour. The boy was clearly from one of those. He was staring around in awe, his mouth slightly agape, trying to take in the impossible grandeur of the chamber. He was a tiny speck of vulnerable flesh in a sea of political power and ancient grudges. Beside the entrance stood an officer of the Galactic Security Corps. It was a being I'd always been wary of, a Silexian, tall, gaunt, wrapped in a chitinous exoskeleton that gleamed with a cruel, oily sheen. They were bred for security and were known for their rigid adherence to protocol and their total, almost mechanical, lack of empathy. Their face was a nightmare of mandibles and multifaceted, emotionless eyes. This one was waiting for someone, probably a handler from the Vorkesh delegation. Its posture was coiled tense, like a wire pulled too tight. The boy, in his wide-eyed wonder, broke away from his guide for a moment. His feet, in their new little boots, carried him in a wobbly arc towards a decorative fountain in the antechamber. It was a beautiful thing, a cascade of liquid light that sang a haunting four-note melody. It was also, technically, off-limits to non-delegates. The Grom guide, slow and ponderous, was still 5 seconds behind. The Silexian officer saw the boy. It moved with that unnerving, fluid speed that spoke of predator ancestry. It didn't yell, didn't give any warning. It simply extended one of its long, spindly arms, tipped with a barbed, metallic claw, and with a sharp, dismissive gesture, it struck the boy on the shoulder, shoving him away from the fountain. I heard the impact, a sickening, dull thwack of metal and chitin against soft tissue. The boy was sent sprawling. He didn't cry out. He just hit the polished stone floor with a small, breathless grunt. For a moment there was utter, deafening silence. Then a wave of gasps and murmurs rippled through the gallery, echoing in the grand chamber. The boy slowly pushed himself up, his face pale with shock. There was a red, angry welt already forming on his shoulder, a violent bruise against his skin. His eyes were wide, not with tears but with a kind of uncomprehending shock. He looked at his own arm, then at the cold, metallic face of the Silexian, then back at his arm again, as if trying to reconcile the facts. The Silexian didn't even look at the boy. It simply returned its gaze to the corridor, as if nothing had happened. It was the casual, dismissive cruelty of the act that made my blood run cold. It was just property that had been out of line. The guide finally caught up, his gnarled hands trembling as he tried to soothe the boy. But the child was in shock. He didn't want to be touched. He just stood there holding his own shoulder, his small chest heaving with silent, shallow breaths. I saw his father, a human diplomat whose name I knew was John Sterling, almost vault the delegation barrier. His face was a mask of pure, incandescent rage and fatherly terror. But the human security detail was already there, a wall of flesh and armor holding him back. "John, don't," one of them hissed, his voice tight with strain. "You'll start a war." The council chamber had frozen. The debate over the fungus had stopped. All eyes were on the small, frightened human boy and the cold, unrepentant Silexian officer. The Vorkesh representative looked smug. The Ethel representative's crest feathers were flat against her head, a sign of profound distress. The Grom had gone utterly silent, their seismic humming ceasing completely. It was a diplomatic nightmare. A minor altercation, a child harmed, but the implications were seismic. The Silexian was enforcing a rule, but the rule was pettiness, the punishment excessive. The council's ancient Byzantine rules of conduct favored the officer. He was just doing his job. A formal complaint would be lodged, reviewed by a subcommittee, and maybe, in a century or two, a strongly worded letter of reprimand would be issued. That was the way of things. Justice was a slow, ponderous beast in the galaxy. It favored power, and a lone, terrified human child, even the child of a diplomat, was power's opposite. John Sterling was being held back, his face a mask of agony. He knew the rules as well as anyone. His heart screamed for his son, but his brain knew that a single punch thrown would be the spark that lit a war the human race wasn't ready for. He was a diplomat. He had to wait. The tension in the room was so thick, I felt like I was drowning in it. The only sound was the faint, tinny voice of the Vorkesh representative, droning on about the importance of maintaining decorum, his sarcasm dripping like venom. The Silexian was still as a statue, a monument to galaxy-wide bureaucratic indifference. And the boy just stood there, clutching his bruised shoulder, looking lost. He was the tiniest, most isolated being in the entire chamber, A single hurt soul in a sea of politicians and power brokers. His father was being held back. The galaxy's justice system was a joke, and no one, it seemed, no one was coming to help him. That's when the council's main entrance, the massive doors of solid neutronium, didn't open. They exploded. There was no boom, no shattering of glass. One moment they were there, solid and unyielding, sealing the chamber from the rest of the station. The next, they were a cloud of impossibly fine dust, shimmering in the light of the captured nebulae. The silence that followed the explosion was absolute, a pressure that felt physical. Through the cloud of subatomic debris, I saw her. A young woman, human. She was tall for a human female, with a lean, powerful frame that seemed to hum with barely restrained energy. Her hair was a wild mane of dark red, almost copper, and her eyes were the color of a star-going supernova. They burned with a cold, terrifying fire. She wasn't dressed for diplomacy. She was dressed for war. She wore a battered, scuffed set of kinetic armor, the kind used by planetary marines. It was pockmarked with scars from energy weapons and scorched from atmosphere reentries. Over it, she wore a long coat of a dark, non-reflective material that seemed to drink the light around it. A sidearm was holstered on her hip, its design unfamiliar to me. It was the kind of weapon you didn't show off, the kind you used. She stood in the ruined doorway, her presence like a sudden, unexpected thunderclap. She was the center of a universe that had just stopped. The galactic power brokers stared, their ancient protocols failing them. What was this? A terrorist attack, an assassination. The ethel representative let out a high, trilling sound of alarm. The Grom hummed a deep warning note that vibrated in my bones. The Vorkesh representative recoiled, hissing. She didn't look at the Vorkesh. She didn't look at the council. She looked at the Silexian officer, her eyes locking onto him with the precision of a targeting system. Then her gaze swept past him, finding the little boy who was still standing there, holding his shoulder. Her expression, which had been a terrifying mask of cold fury, shifted. For a single, fleeting moment, a profound, almost impossibly deep sorrow flickered across her face. It was the look of a person who had seen too much, who knew what it was like to be hurt and alone. It was the look of someone who had been that child. Then just as quickly, the sorrow was gone, replaced by that burning, glacial wrath. She took a single, deliberate step into the chamber. Her boot landed with a soft, firm click on the polished floor. The sound was tiny, but it was as loud as a gunshot in the perfect silence. She walked with an economy of motion that was terrifying in its calm, like a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. The council members watched, frozen, as she advanced. The human delegation, who had been holding John Sterling back, tensed. One man, a senior security officer, stepped forward. "Officer, citizen, you are in violation of council protocol and must identify yourself and state your purpose," he said, his voice a little too high. She didn't even glance at him. She kept walking. "Move," she said. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, as if she was declaring a law of physics. The officer stood his ground. He was a brave man, but his jaw was tight, and his hand was trembling near his holster. "I must ask you to stop." "Move," she said again, her voice unchanged. "Or be moved." There was a finality to her tone that was simply absolute. It was the sound of reason at the end of its tether. It was the sound of something that was going to happen with or without your cooperation. The officer, his face pale, took a step back. He had a family on some far-flung colony. He was brave, but he wasn't stupid. She walked on, her path a straight, unimpeded line towards the Silexian. The boy, sensing her approach, looked up. His eyes, full of tears and confusion, met hers. She stopped in front of the Silexian, looking down at him. He was tall, but she seemed to tower over him. He was still frozen, a monument to indifference, but I saw a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his chitinous armor. He was afraid. He just couldn't process it. This was a human, a Deathworlder female. What could she possibly do? It was just a child. There were rules. The entire galaxy was holding its breath, watching the confrontation between the cold, unyielding machine of bureaucratic power, and the silent, boiling fury of a human woman. "Tell me," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, clear and resonant. "Did you enjoy it?" The question hung in the air, a simple, damning accusation. The Silexian officer's mandibles twitched. He had no answer. Part 2: The Reckoning. The Silexian officer, finally finding his voice, let out a sound that was a horrible, grating, metallic hiss. It was the Silexian equivalent of a laugh, a noise of pure, condescending contempt. The creature was interfering with a council display, it stated, its words translated by my earpiece into a cold, dispassionate monotone. I was enforcing protocol. "It is a minor infraction. It is beneath the notice of the council." "Minor," she repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. She didn't shout it. She said it softly, almost to herself, as if she was trying to understand a concept she was fundamentally incapable of grasping. "You struck a sentient child, a defenseless child. You drew blood, you left a mark." Her voice grew quieter. "And you call it minor." The Vorkesh representative, clearly feeling he had regained control of the situation, leaned forward. "This is a violation of council security. Whoever this woman is, she is clearly unstable. She has entered a secure facility and threatened an officer. Guards." The command echoed in the chamber, but the guards were all present. They were the ones who had just failed to stop her. They looked at the Vorkesh, then back at the woman, and didn't move. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't threatening anyone else. She was just standing there, asking a question. Her hand moved. It was so fast, so fluid, it was like watching water flow. It had to be a cybernetic enhancement, or perhaps she was simply that fast. Her fingers closed around the Silexian's wrist. The chitinous armor creaked in protest under her grip. I heard a sound like grinding pebbles, the sound of a being who had never been touched like that before, who was suddenly, undeniably, a captive of a force far greater than its own. The officer's other arm came up, a bladed appendage, but she was faster. She twisted his wrist, and the Silexian let out a shriek, a high-pitched, piercing sound of agony. The blade clattered to the floor. "You are in breach of Protocol 12A, Section 3, she said, still calm, still utterly in control. "Excessive force against a non-combatant. You are in breach of the Interstellar Sentient Rights Charter, Article 4, the unlawful use of force on a minor. You are also in breach of the general tenets of Don't Be a Dick, which, while not codified, are a universal constant in any society that wishes to be considered civilized." She was reciting ancient laws, forgotten charters, things that had been signed in a burst of post-war idealism thousands of years ago and were now just dusty historical footnotes. No one enforced them, but she was enforcing them. The Silexian struggled, his long limbs flailing. He was a creature of terror and protocol, not of open combat. He tried to use his other arm to jab at her, to poke at her eyes with a sharp, barbed limb. She just stepped aside, still holding his wrist. She was treating him like a disobedient child, a creature that was beneath her full attention. It was a humiliation that was infinitely more cutting than any physical blow. "I am a civilian," the Silexian rasped. "You have no authority over me. I am under the protection of the Galactic Security Corps. You will be arrested. You will be tried. You will be." She tightened her grip. The grinding sound intensified. "You are not a civilian," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur. "You are a bully. And I've spent my whole life dealing with bullies." "Who are you?" a new voice boomed. It was the Grand Arbiter, the leader of the Ethel delegation, her voice a multi-layered harmony. "State your name and your authority. This is a council of the galaxy, not a playground for your human theatrics. You are risking interstellar war." I finally found my voice, my own pathetic, crackling sound next to hers. "Her name is Captain Kalen," I said, reading the life signature from the Federation's own biodatabase that was slowly filling my screen. "Captain Kalen of the Sol Federation Marine Corps, on personal leave." The Grand Arbiter seemed to inflate with indignation. A mere captain, on leave. She has no standing here, she is. Kaylin finally turned her head to look at the Arbiter. It was a gaze of pure, undiluted contempt. I am not a captain on leave, she said. I was a captain. I resigned 3 months ago. She gave a slight, self-deprecating shrug. Killed too many people, lost my taste for it. The casual admission of her past sent another wave of shock through the room. It wasn't a brag. It was a simple statement of fact, like someone saying they used to be a plumber. What is your name? The Arbiter pressed, her feathers bristling. Alina, she said, giving the name with a weary sigh. Just Alina. Just Alina, the Arbiter repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. Just a human with a personal grievance. You have no authority here. I will have my own security escort you from the premises, and you will be. You will do nothing, Alina said, her voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the Arbiter's flowery pronouncement. You will all do nothing, because you are all so afraid of a war that you don't see that a war has already started, a war against common decency, and you are losing it. She looked around the room at the alien faces, at the humans, at all of them. You let this happen, she said, gesturing with her chin towards the child. You let one of your own be terrorized by a creature that is all uniform and no spine. And you did nothing. You are all guilty, every last one of you. Her eyes fell on me for a brief, piercing moment. I felt a flush of shame. She was right. I'd been an observer. I'd watched a child be struck and did nothing. My job was to watch, not to act, but watching was a form of consent. Then she turned back to the Silexian, her voice dropping to a low, intimate whisper as if she was sharing a secret. I watched my little brother die, you know, not in a war, not in a grand battle. He was playing in a field on our colony. A damaged ground car lost its brakes. No one was there. No one saw it happen until it was too late. He was 7, the same age as him. She looked at the boy, a flicker of the raw emotion returning to her eyes. So you see, she said, pulling the Silexian's attention back to her. When I see a child in pain, it's not just a minor infraction to me. It's not political. It's personal. She took a step back, still holding the Silexian's wrist. She was looking at him now, her gaze a clinical, detached assessment. Do you know what a Deathworlder is, officer? The Silexian hissed, a sound of defiance. I know what a human is, a vermin species from a violent world. Close, Alina said, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. But you're missing the point. Our world is so dangerous that we evolved a very specific trait. We can go from a state of quiet contemplation to a state of complete and utter annihilation in a single chaotic second. There's no warning. It's a switch. She tilted her head, her smile fading. I'm trying very hard not to flip that switch. She let go of his wrist. The Silexian stumbled back, clutching his arm, hissing. The relief on his face was palpable. He was free. Now, she said, her voice returning to its normal volume, she addressed the entire room. The Galactic Council, the seat of power in the known universe. You have an official grievance procedure, a filing system. It's slow, it's cumbersome, and it favors the powerful, but it's all you've got, so I'm going to give you a choice. She held up a hand, ticking off fingers. 1. You can try to arrest me for this disturbance. It will be a fight, I promise you that. The arrest will fail, and a lot of people will get hurt. When it's all over, I will be gone, and you will have nothing but a bigger mess than you started with. She held up a second finger. 2. You can kick me out, lock the doors, and pretend this never happened. You can go back to your trade disputes and your political posturing. That's the coward's way out. But I'd bet my own ship that's the option you'll choose. The Grom representative rumbled a low, questioning note. And the third option? It asked, its voice like rocks grinding together. Alina looked at the child, still standing there, a tiny, frightened figure. She gave him a sad, small smile. Then she looked back at the Silexian. He was the key. He was the living symbol of the system's failure. The third option, she said, her voice ringing with steel, is that I give you a gift. Before anyone could react, she was in motion again. Her hand moved like a bolt of lightning, detaching the sidearm from her hip. The Silexian officer, clearly expecting her to attack him again, flinched. The guards reached for their weapons, but she didn't aim it at him. She held it up, a compact, brutal-looking piece of technology. It was a pulse pistol, a simple, effective weapon. Everyone in the room recognized it. It was the standard-issue weapon of the Silexian officers. It was a weapon designed to cause maximum pain with minimum tissue damage, a weapon for intimidation, a weapon for causing terror. "This is the weapon you used to strike the child," she said, her voice low and steady. "It's a Silexian Mark XIII. It leaves a distinctive bruise, an electrical burn. They heal, but they leave a scar, a little reminder of the day you met a bully. The boy will have that scar. He'll carry it for the rest of his life." She turned her head to the council. "But you can't give him a fair trial," she said. "You can't even give him a formal apology. The rules don't allow for it. The rules favor the powerful, so I'm going to give him the next best thing." And with a movement so quick it was almost unseeable, she reversed her grip on the pulse pistol and drove the stock hard into the Silexian's forehead. There was a sickening crack, the sound of chitin fracturing. The officer, a creature of myth and terror, dropped like a stone. He didn't fall gracefully, he just crumpled, his long legs folding under him, and hit the floor with a thud. The sonorous hum of the Grom ceased. The gentle music of the fountain seemed to falter. Alina stood there, the pistol still in her hand, looking down at the unconscious officer. He was bleeding from a fresh wound, a dark, viscous fluid that was definitely not human. She didn't gloat. She didn't look triumphant. She just looked tired, profoundly, deeply tired. She looked at the council members. The Vorkesh was frozen. The Ethel were fluttering with distress. The Grom were still as mountains. The humans were staring, their faces a mixture of horror, awe, and a strange, grim satisfaction. "There's a new law now," she said, her voice quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. "It's not written down anywhere. You can't file a motion against it, but it's the most important law in the galaxy." She looked at the boy. "Don't touch the little ones." Then she turned, the pistol still in her hand, and walked back towards the ruined entrance. She didn't run. She didn't look back. She just walked, a lone figure in a battered coat, towards the cloud of shimmering dust that had once been the door. She was walking away. The silence lasted for a full 10 seconds. Then the room erupted. Vorkesh were screaming for security. Ethel were collapsing in faint. The Grom were humming in a frantic, chaotic rhythm. The human delegation was a knot of panicked whispers. And the little boy, his shoulders still throbbing, just stared at the ruined door, his wide eyes tracking the figure of the woman who had spoken for him when no one else would. I stood there still holding my datapad, the recording matrix now showing an alert, signal loss. Subject departed perimeter. I had lost her. The mysterious just Alina had vanished into the wind. A few minutes later, after the chaos had calmed down to a feverish level, the true impact of what happened began to sink in. The Silexian officer was being taken away on a stretcher, his chitinous face a ruin of pain. The Grand Arbiter was declaring a formal investigation. The Vorkesh were demanding sanctions against the Sol Federation for harboring a dangerous fugitive. John Sterling was holding his son, who had finally started to cry, the shock wearing off, the pain of the bruise now a tangible thing. I was trying to organize my notes, my hands shaking slightly. A diplomat from the Ethel delegation, a beautiful being named Teles, found me in the chaos. "Elias," she said, her voice soft and melodious, "tell me about her." "Who?" I asked, pretending I didn't know. "The human woman." "Alina, who was she? Was she a hero, a terrorist, a ghost?" I looked at her, then back at the chaos in the chamber. I thought about the child, the officer, the speech she gave. I thought about the impossible thing I had just witnessed. "I don't know," I said, my voice quiet, "but I have a feeling we haven't seen the last of her." Part 3: The Echo. The Galactic Council didn't explode as many had feared. It didn't descend into open war. The political machine, as was its nature, began to spin. It was a slow, grinding, bureaucratic process, but it was a process nonetheless. The Vorkesh made a lot of noise, threatening to withdraw from the trade treaties and unleash sanctions. But their threats were hollow, and they knew it. Their economy was more intertwined with the human economy than they cared to admit. The Ethel, ever the diplomats, called for calm and a thorough review of the Silexian incident. The Grom, true to their nature, simply observed, their seismic hums a constant, unreadable presence in the council's chambers. The human delegation was in an uproar. They demanded the Silexian officer be formally charged, but the Galactic Security Corps, deeply embarrassed, had already retired him. The incident was being swept under the rug, as was standard practice. The boy, the real victim, was given a formal apology from the Grand Arbiter herself, a gesture that was, everyone knew, completely meaningless. It was for show. But something had changed. A seed had been planted. It wasn't about the trade routes or the political power plays. It was about the fundamental, unspoken truth of the galaxy. The truth that Alina had stripped bare with a single, brutal blow. The official story, as it was relayed to the Galactic press, was a sanitized version of events. A minor disturbance was caused by a disgruntled human civilian who was apprehended and remanded to Sol Federation custody. It was a lie, of course. She hadn't been apprehended. She had vanished. No one knew where she had gone, and as far as anyone could tell, the Sol Federation wasn't looking for her. They were, in fact, quietly, discreetly covering her tracks. A week passed, the furore died down, the trade disputes resumed. The galaxy went back to its business. But the memory of that woman, of that moment, refused to fade. It was in the way the Vorkesh guards now flinched when a human got too close. It was in the way the Ethel now looked at human children with a new, slightly awed respect. It was in the way the Grom hummed a slightly different note when they passed the humans. It was in me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the galaxy had seen a ghost, a specter of justice from a simpler, more violent time. I was obsessed. I pulled up her file, cross-referenced it with everything in the Federation's database. It was a remarkable document. Alina Vance. My own surname I discovered with a jolt. A distant cousin from the outer colonies, the kind you only met at family reunions when you were both too young to remember. A Marine. Decorated. A legend. She'd seen action in the Krell incursion, a brutal war against a race of crystalline beings who were indifferent to pain and death. She'd lost her squad, her friends, and nearly her own life. She'd become a killing machine, a weapon. But then, a year ago, she'd just stopped. She'd resigned, turned in her gun, and disappeared into civilian life. The official reason was psychological trauma, but I suspected it was something else. I suspected she'd had enough of the big picture, enough of the political games, and had decided to focus on the small things, on the children, on the ones who needed protecting. A month later, I was assigned to a new posting, a small, quiet station on the edge of the Orion Arm. It was a dull, boring assignment. The kind of place where nothing interesting ever happened. It was a relief. The station was a small, unassuming outpost, a waypoint for cargo ships and the occasional diplomat. The dominant species were the Boran, a reptilian race who were quiet and industrious. I settled into a routine of paperwork and quiet observation. The incident on the council chamber had faded to a distant, surreal memory. I began to think I had imagined it, that it was a fever dream of political tension and my own overactive imagination. One evening, I was walking through the station's commercial district, a long, winding corridor lined with small shops and eateries. The air was thick with the scent of Boran spices, a pungent, earthy smell that I was slowly beginning to tolerate. I was looking for a place to grab a bite to eat, lost in my own thoughts. I heard the commotion before I saw it, a raised voice, not angry but firm, a sound of distress. My feet carried me towards the sound, a primal instinct I couldn't shake. I rounded a corner and found a small crowd gathered around a food stall. The stall owner, a Boran with a look of quiet desperation on his face, was arguing with a young human, A boy, no older than 10. He was thin, his clothes patched and worn. He was clutching a small, synthetic loaf of bread, his eyes wide with fear. A Silexian officer, a hulking specimen with a cruel glint in his eyes, was standing there, his hand out. "I told you, you vermin," the Silexian hissed, its voice a horrible scraping sound. "You can't afford this. It's a restricted item. Now give it to me." The boy shook his head, clutching the bread tighter. "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm hungry. I haven't eaten in 2 days." The Silexian sneered. "Hunger is not a currency, child. Give it to me or I will take it." The barn vendor was trying to intervene, his voice a low, placating rumble. "Sir, the boy is a refugee. He's from the Vorkesh border. He has no family. It is a small thing." "It is a rule," the Silexian snapped, his voice getting louder. "The law is the law. I don't care about his pathetic story. Give me the bread." The boy was about to cry. I could see the tears welling up in his eyes. He was so small, so helpless, just like the other boy, just like the one in the council chamber. The parallels were too stark, too cruel. My heart hammered in my chest. I was frozen. The old fear, the fear of intervention, of making things worse, of becoming a target, was back. And then a voice cut through the commotion. It was a woman's voice, clear and sharp. "Is there a problem, officer?" The crowd parted, and there she was, Elena. She was wearing the same battered coat, the same scuffed armor. Her red hair was pulled back, and her eyes were as sharp and intense as I remembered. She was looking at the Silexian, a faint, amused smile on her face. The Silexian turned, hissing. "This is not your concern, civilian. Move along." "Oh, I disagree," she said, stepping forward. "I have a particular interest in children who are being bullied by uniformed thugs." The Silexian blinked. "What is this? Do you know this boy?" "No," she said, her gaze falling on the child. The boy looked up at her, his eyes full of tears. He saw her, and something in his expression changed. He saw a grown-up, a human, a protector. He saw the face of hope. "But I know you, officer," she said, turning her attention back to the Silexian. "I know your kind. You're a jack-booted bully who gets off on terrorizing those weaker than you." She took a step closer to him, her presence filling the space. "And I'm starting to think that's the only thing the universe has too many of." The Silexian officer looked at her, his multifaceted eyes scanning her. He saw a human female, a civilian, alone. He was the law, he was a creature of power. "You are interfering with a legal enforcement action," he snapped. "No, I'm not," she said. "You want the bread. The boy has the bread. That's a private transaction between a customer and a vendor. You don't have a warrant for his arrest. You're just being a bully." The Silexian officer's mandibles twitched with frustration. "I am not a bully. I am a member of the Galactic Security Corps, and I demand—" "You demand nothing," she said, her voice dropping to that low, quiet tone that I remembered so well. It was the tone that preceded violence. "You want the bread, take it from me." She spread her arms wide, a gesture of pure, unadulterated challenge. The Silexian stared at her, his grip tightening on his sidearm. The crowd held its breath. The boy held his breath. He looked at her casual, unafraid stance, at the twinkle in her eyes, and he saw what everyone in the galaxy had started to fear. He saw the flicker of madness. He saw the potential for violence that was always simmering just beneath the surface. He didn't move. He didn't try to take the bread. He just stood there, frozen, his mandibles clicking in a display of utter confusion. Elena smiled, a slow, predatory smile. "Go on," she said. "Make my day." A long, tense moment passed. The Silexian officer's eyes darted to the boy, to the crowd, to the watching faces of the Boran, and he saw something he didn't like. He saw solidarity. He saw the quiet, unspoken support for this strange woman. He was on his own. He had no backup. He was alone in a sea of potential witnesses who were not on his side. With a final, furious hiss, he turned on his heel and stalked away. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief. The boy, his face pale, looked up at Alina. She knelt down, her eyes softening. "Here," she said, reaching into her own pocket. She pulled out a credit chit. "Buy yourself something to eat, a real meal, and some new clothes maybe." The boy stared at the chit. "But why?" She gave him a sad, gentle smile. "Because that's what people do," she said. "They help each other, and I saw you needed help." The boy took the chit, his hand trembling. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't mention it," she said, giving his shoulder a quick, reassuring squeeze. "Now make sure you get something with protein in it. You look like you need it." She stood up and her eyes met mine. A moment of recognition passed between us, a silent acknowledgement of a shared secret. She gave me a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She remembered me from the council chamber. Then just as quickly she turned and walked away, her coat billowing behind her, disappearing into the crowd. The crowd began to disperse. The boring vendor was bustling, telling everyone it was nothing, just a misunderstanding. The boy stood there, clutching the credit chit, his face a mixture of awe and confusion. I watched him, a lump forming in my throat. I looked down the corridor, but she was gone. She had simply vanished into the everyday life of the station, a phantom of justice who appeared when she was needed and disappeared when she was done. I didn't follow her. I didn't try to thank her. I didn't need to. I knew now what she was. She wasn't a superhero. She wasn't a revolutionary. She was just a person who had seen the worst of the galaxy and had decided to fight against it in her own small way. She wasn't trying to fix the system. She was just trying to make sure the system's failures didn't land on the most vulnerable. Later that night, as I sat in my small quarters staring out at the endless void of space, I thought about her. I thought about the two incidents, separated by a galaxy, connected by a single common thread. A child, a bully, a woman who refused to look away. The galaxy is a vast, cold, and often cruel place. It's filled with vast empires, political games, and unimaginable wealth. But Alina had shown me the truth. The most important battles aren't fought on massive battlefields. They're fought in small, unassuming places, in a food stall, on a council chamber floor. They're fought over a child's meal, a bruised shoulder, a simple act of kindness. The Silexian officer had been a symptom of a disease that had infected the galaxy. But Alina was the cure. She was the reminder that, no matter how vast the darkness, there is always a flicker of light. A person willing to stand up. A person willing to fight. A person willing to walk into a room full of galactic power brokers and say, "Don't touch the little ones." That was the law she had written that day, and it was a law that was starting to spread. You could feel it in the air, a tremor, a whisper, a shift in the tectonic plates of the universe. Justice was no longer something you filed a motion for. It was becoming something personal, something you had to fight for. And in a galaxy that was slowly learning to remember its own laws of decency, sometimes a single person with a single act of courage is all it takes to start a rebellion. The rebellion of the kind. Because she was right. The most important law of all wasn't written down. You couldn't file a motion against it, but it was the law that mattered. Don't touch the little ones. I closed my eyes, the image of her walking away, a lone figure in a battered coat, etched into my memory. I knew then that the galaxy, for all its ancient grandeur and political machinations, was about to change. And it all started with a woman who knew that some laws are worth breaking.